Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today again in another Wednesday of the essays discussions. This time we will continue our discussions on ethics and psychology, and today's essay is Altruism as Appeasement. We have James Valliant, as it's now a tradition. He is the author of Creating Christ and the Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics. Please feel free to send us a super chat if you are interested in us discussing an issue in this regard. So let's start. And James, I think that the first question is broadly, what is the psychological phenomenon that Ayn Rand is describing in this essay?
Well, this essay sort of assumes that one understands her critique of altruism and assumes a certain basic knowledge of her ethics. And so we're starting here in midstream. This is not for the beginner. And to familiarize oneself with Ayn Rand's critique of altruism, there's no better place than, of course, Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged or her book, The Virtue of Selfishness. For Ayn Rand, altruism is not benevolence, kindness, good feeling towards other people, generosity, or even the selfish importance that other people can represent to us. No, that's not what altruism is about. It's not even about the value, actual value of other people. No, it's the doctrine that says that each individual does not have the right to live for his or her own sake, that their own life and happiness is an insufficient moral justification for action, for living, for anything else, that one must, how do they put it these days, live for something greater than oneself if your life is to have any meaning or purpose or moral condition. Now, Ayn Rand asks some very basic questions about this. Why, for example, why is a piece of cake a value in your neighbor's stomach? Why do you have to live for his stomach, but a piece of cake in your stomach isn't a value? It ignores the real question of what makes something a value. It ignores the real questions that underlie ethics. On the other hand, altruism is assumed. It has all the power of ethics behind it, the ethics of centuries, millennia behind it. It says self-sacrifice is the good, noble way to be, and that selfishness is the essence of evil. Now, understanding Ayn Rand's critique of altruism, you begin to understand that there's a psychological manifestation, in fact, several psychological manifestations that must be the result of altruism, accepting altruism. One is to reject the mind, to, in effect, say, well, morality has nothing to do with the mind. In fact, the mind is not going to get me where I want to go. But there are people who do not renounce their minds. There are still people who know that they have to think. That's their only means of cognition at some implicit level, and have tried to retain, in effect, the value of their mind and the value of thinking. But if you think, but for just 2 seconds, altruism in itself requires a renunciation of the mind. The widespread acceptance of altruism creates this widespread sense of guilt. It has all, as I say, all the power of morality. And so most people, by emotional intimidation, not by intellectual argument, by traditional inertia, have accepted altruism. They accept it by means of the social pressures that we get when we're adolescents, or we get it as she cited the historian that she met, some old distinguished historian who's still sort of compromising for the altruists. Yeah. I know I'm talking about social duty, but we have to talk about that. Otherwise, the masses won't grasp capitalism. They'll never appreciate what we're doing unless we tell them that we're altruists serving them. So it's a form of guilt. It's a form of default. It's what people accept by emotional and social pressure. And so when she means altruism as appeasement, it's the state of mind which necessarily occurs when a person still wants to think, but has accepted as a given, sort of an axiom, the ethics of altruism. It is destructive. It is nonetheless destructive of the mind and values, no matter how you slice it. And it's going to result in certain psychological manifestations. The appeaser, in effect, the one who appeases society by being an altruist. Yes, we're doing it all for you. We don't claim any right to exist for our own sake. That person has caved in on an important issue, a life and death issue, psychologically. Selfishness, his own set of values, his own mind. He's in effect divorced morality from his mind. To do that must necessarily result in a kind of cynicism about humanity.
I was hoping to bring this thing a bit more down to earth, and I was hoping to give you an example of my life. And that has to do when I was in high school, particularly. I was usually very lonely, and because I was smarter, and whenever people reached to me, it was they wanted free homework. But there were these smarter people who were usually my friends at the beginning, and they started to do really silly things, which they knew that they were silly, that they weren't on their character, and they did it just because they wanted to become accepted because of that. I never had that kind of temptation of doing that because I wasn't interested in doing that. Do you think that kind of behavior that they engage in could be an example of this?
Well, it's certainly true that what we're talking about here is a kind of social pressure that gets put on teenagers in particular to conform, from parents, from religion, from education, from, most importantly, from our other peers, like you say. And the talented and gifted, the smart, altruism sets up a sort of horrible conflict. Anyone who has a positive value, personal value, realizes at some level this is a personal value to them. They're different. They have to apologize, in effect, to those who don't have it. That's one of the implications of altruism. So you're an outsider precisely because you're intelligent. You're an outsider precisely because you're not doing something just to go along with the crowd, even if it seems silly, irrational, or self-destructive. You're being rational, but that singles you out, you see. You're being different. You're standing outside the crowd, which is, in effect, what altruism demands. More than that, at a deeper level, altruism demands you surrender your mind about the justification of this. I can't even think through why I need to do this. I just need to accept it and apologize for my ability. Apologize for the fact that I'm not the weakest, not the most dependent, not the most needy. Because you see, altruism, in Ayn Rand's view, reverses values. It makes disvalue a value. And it makes the productive, the intelligent, those who are actually doing something and contributing, they, in effect, are carrying a burden of guilt that they have to constantly be apologizing for, and they can't resort to their mind to justify it. So yeah, that is very much the context that we're talking about here. Social metaphysics, an idea that Ayn Rand developed, is the idea, in effect, of surrendering your mind to the mind of others, to the mind of society, the group, whatever the relevant group is, the group of importance is. It is saying, in effect, my judgment isn't mine. I'm going to believe what others believe. This is a little more subtle than just rank social metaphysics. This is the attempt to retain the mind. She's talking about the psychology that attempts to retain the mind, like you as a teenager, attempting to retain the integrity of your consciousness, right, in the face of social pressure. And unlike you, most people cave in to the doctrine of altruism and feel guilty for their ability, have to end up apologizing for any use of their mind. They're trying to, in effect, get away with whatever little use of their mind they can use it for, while still paying obeisance to this doctrine of servitude and altruism, which is, in effect, what it is. It's a doctrine of masters and slaves. It's a doctrine of dictatorship. If you are compelled to surrender your mind, even if just in the realm of morality, if you are divorced morality from reason, and most people do. I mean, consider David Hume. You can't derive an it from an ought from an is. So therefore, many modern ethicists, the elite philosophers, have said there is no rational basis for ethics. Forget it. Once you've done that, or equally, the religious person, no, it's all irrational. It's just commands from God. It's the product of some divine revelation. They've divorced morality from reason too. Once you've divorced morality from reason and fact, you must become an ethical cynic to the point that you have contempt for humanity, a contempt for humanity that emanates from your self-contempt. You have chucked morality in. That is, so you're, in effect, you project upon all of humanity the same cynical rejection of ethics that altruism has forced on you if you're appeasing altruism, appeasing the world, and their demand that you, in effect, be their slave.
Thank you. I think we will talk a bit more about how that process, how the process develops as we continue with the discussion. But I was hoping if we could still be discussing broadly what this psychological phenomenon is. And that's basically, Rand talks about evasion as some kind of broader psychological phenomenon. And I would say that this is a particular kind of evasion. But against that, against what other psychological phenomenon could we be distinguishing this altruism as appeasement against what are other psychological evasion? I mean, you've already mentioned second-handedness, but
right, the outright social metaphysics is simply saying, and this is, like I said, this is a subtler point she's making here. This is a sort of applied social metaphysics in one area while still trying to retain your mind in other areas, which is impossible. Really, the most selfish thing you can do is think for yourself. And everyone at some level knows that thinking for myself makes me different, puts me outside. I'm questioning the premises of my society. And that puts you in a position, a psychological position of insecurity, where you're simply apologizing, where you're feeling guilty, in effect, for it. Altruism is impossible to practice, too. This impossibility to practice will also contribute to a cynicism, a general cynicism about ethics. People are rotten, because they cannot live up to this impossible ethics that has nothing to do with human life and achieving human life on Earth. That's one big problem right there. But as I say, the deeper problem is that they've rejected their mind when it comes to ethics itself. And that's a sort of personal betrayal that must necessarily affect everything that we think, must affect every decision that we make. It makes us feel guilty for every selfish thing that we end up actually doing, like thinking. I mean, every breath we take, every morsel of food we eat is selfish. Every thought we think is selfish. And when you've put your mind in conflict like that, morality versus the mind, then what you've done is you've, in effect, consider, for example, utilitarians. Utilitarians put this pseudoscientific, they're attempting to retain their mind, you see, a form of rationality, while still just sort of accepting as an axiom altruism. So how best do we mathematically deploy altruism? That's a classic example of a person attempting to retain their mind to some extent while accepting a rank religious premise without any thought at all. But of course, consider utilitarianism. Every morsel of food I eat comes at the expense of someone else or something, or has to be calculated with respect to their well-being. That's necessarily going to turn me into a cynic about myself, my ability to live up to this ethics, and about ethics in general. People are mindless brutes. They need this altruism to keep them in line, to keep them enslaved, in effect, and duty-bound to everyone else. So you have what it does is it implies and requires a rotten view of humanity. People are brutes, in effect. There is no way of ruling yourself by the mind. People have to be ruled by force.
Thank you. Jonathan has made a contribution. Thank you very much, Jonathan. He says, happy to selfishly support ARC UK, and you should do too. And yes, you should do too. Okay, so I would like to discuss a bit more the process on how this kind of mentality is developed. And you've already mentioned the first two steps that Ayn states in her essay, and that's the knowledge that this person is hated by his ability, particularly his intelligence, and also the concession that if they let them use their mind, he will work on their service, or in other words, he will accept the code of altruism in exchange of letting them use their intelligence. Would you have anything else to say about that, or could we move to the
Well, what I find from your example that was really interesting is that, of course, lots of intelligent, lots of talented, lots of special young people feel that alienation, feel that separation, feel the guilt for not being the same as everyone else, as if their ability is something they have to apologize for. And instead of having the pride that you did, that is to say, the self-esteem that you did in your own mind and the value of your own life, they will, in effect, concede what's considered by an axiom on, right, left, religious, secular, about ethics. And that necessarily will turn them into a cynic. And they'll project that cynicism onto the world. The world is full of brutes that need to be ruled. One of the most brilliant moments in this essay is sort of in the middle of this essay where Ayn Rand, talk about calling not only was it sort of true implicitly in her time, it's become far, far more obvious in our time even. Liberals love to talk about how they're Democrats and it's all for the people, but they are the most rank elitists. People are cattle that have to be herded, in effect. And the ordinary person to the liberal is just some, in my country, it's classic. You're some countrified yahoo who hasn't been to college or university. You don't know what the heck you're talking about. These stupid Trump voters, not that Trump voters were all that intelligent, but all of them, but there are all these stupid Trump voters. They're uneducated yahoos. They need to be ruled by an elite. They need to be ruled by an elite. But Ayn Rand points out it's not just liberals. It's conservatives. They've bought the premise too, only they're much more cowardly and timorous about it. Yes, of course, people are brutes. Yes, of course, the mind doesn't rule people. So the best way to approach them is to cater to them, flatter their stupidity, give them talk down to them with short words and use empty ancient bromides or religious platitudes to talk down to these stupid people. But both of them, in effect, have a low view of humanity, a view of humanity that needs to be ruled. One takes and today you can really see the conservatives taking the populist side of things, right? What used to be the sort of working class view of Americans in the Democrats' mind has now been adopted by the Republicans. Yes, people are that stupid and need to be herded around just like that. Ayn Rand nailed it, didn't she? The elitism that you'll find, the different kind of elitism that you'll find on left and right. The Democratic left are the most techno-elitist intellectuals you'll find, and the rest of the world needs to be ruled, in effect. The conservatives are trying to appease what they regard as the stupid yahoos out there.
And from what metaphysical premise is the idea of elitism derived from? What kind of psychological conclusion is behind that?
Well, as we said, there's really no rational, and there really has never been a rational justification for altruism given. It's when you ask the right, they'll tell you, well, it's God's command, and that's how we get into heaven, and they give you mystical justifications. When you talk to people on the left, they'll give you a sort of mystical justification themselves. Well, that's just our feelings, the way we are, our emotions are given, and since our emotions are given, and since that it feels right. But of course, they don't realize that they've just been raised in an altruist culture, and altruism feels right to them because they've cognitively accepted that. On the other hand, by accepting it, they've bought into contempt for the mind, contempt for humanity. The assault, if you don't give me a rational justification for altruism, if you don't tell me that I can think for myself, because I have a right to live for myself, then what you've done is you've attacked reason. And the attack on reason is the attack on intelligence. So anyone with any extraordinary ability or even unusual ability is going to be singled out. They're going to be under suspicion. And that suspicion is going to create an insecurity on their part, a social insecurity. It's going to make them want to appease the crowd at the party, not stand out, not be regarded as, consider how Ayn Rand is regarded as just evil incarnate in some quarters because she advocated a human being's right to live for his or her own sake. She advocated rational self-interest. Talk about standing out of your culture and making yourself an enemy. That's why they must hate her. Left, right, center, you name it. She has stated the one thing she has questioned the one premise that we could never question, altruism. Once you've done that, once you've said that people can rule their lives by their own reason and their own mind and are generally competent to do so, then what you've done is you've shattered the entire racket that is altruism, the entire power racket that really altruism is, because altruism really is about power here on earth. It's not there is no rational justification for it. You have to check out your reason to do it. But the real psychological motive is, of course, to manipulate people here on earth. Altruism is used to justify dictatorship since there have been dictatorships.
One of the things that you mentioned is that their hatred to someone that projects some kind of good, and in this case, Ayn Rand, but they also, in the essay, she also talks about fear, but not fear towards usually the good guys, but also the average people. And one of the examples that she gives is this person who says that this person divides people in three sectors, like the intelligent, the average, and the dull. And the dull are the ones who give them the most fear. But why is that? Where does that fear come from? And what are the implicit views of the world that derive this kind of fear from this person?
I loved her examples here, and I think she introduces it by saying that she's talking to someone who said, a smart person, who said, it's not gangsters or criminals that frighten me, it's the ordinary person. It's gas station attendants and store clerks that fill them with terror. So that what's happened here is that their view of humanity, their view of people as such, their moral status, their rational status, must, by the process of altruism, be shattered. It's really, you're right. It's a strange thing. Instead of fearing those who you might think they would properly fear, the diabolical evil genius, it's the ordinary person, the masses. Their view is that the masses are seething with irrationality and violence, and without the containment of the ethics of altruism, without the containment of some kind of government force or dictatorship, people would just run amok and be monsters. It is a very negative view of humanity that emanates from the cynicism that must emanate from altruism. Altruism rejects reason. Altruism is impossible to live. Altruism, in effect, is a doctrine that says people are rotten, that individuals are not worth living their own lives for. And when you accept that view of humanity, you project it onto the entire world. And of course you believe in some kind of dictatorship. Of course you believe that government needs to control people, because they are, underneath it all, just brutes waiting to get released. Now, of course, most people are not really brutes. Most people would prefer to live in a peaceful society. Most people are capable of functioning and dealing with their own lives and surviving on their own. Thank you very much. They're not the wicked things. Now, they're not guilt-free if they're accepting altruism, but to the extent they do. But the point is that they're not inherently violent, brutish thugs just seething to get out and commit crimes. That is necessarily the view of humanity that altruism leaves you with.
If I have a lot of fear for those people that are in the streets asking for money, like the blue vests that they were in, am I kind of following that mentality?
Right.
Am I, or no?
Well, no, I think that if you have a specific fear about a specific issue, I mean, if some stranger who you don't know walks, threatening alley up to you or something, that's one thing. No, and if there is a demonstration on the street or something that looks like it's getting violent, obviously, or if there are criminals and gangsters, that's something to get frightened about. But we're not talking about a situation in which there's rational fear. We're talking about an overall view of humanity that you carry with you, and that people are inherently this way, that moral or intellectual improvement is not possible. They won't get it. They can't see it. They're just dangerous. That must necessarily be the psychology behind it. And what a terrifying existence to live in, huh? People are scary things. Ordinary people are scary things. And it's a kind of projection. What psychologists say projection. We only have direct access to our own consciousness. To the extent that the altruist appeaser has accepted altruism by default, or as some kind of religious axiom, or by social pressure, but still wants to retain his mind, what he's done is he's put his mind necessarily in service of this rotten view of humanity.
Thank you. So Robert has sent super chat. Thank you very much, Robert. And Bonnie says, in the animal world, the chick born different may well be pecked to death, but we are not animals. All we have came from someone who was different. Altruism and appeasement come from fear of the group.
You know, of course, any progress in evolution requires mutation. The different chick survives and has offspring, right? And somehow manages to survive. But most mutations don't work, right? And are bad for the species. And so there are species who will just destroy the different offspring. And you know what's terrible with human beings is we don't have any instinct like that. Our tool of knowledge, our basic tool of survival, is the individual use of the individual mind. Every new idea started in one brain. So that individualism makes sense for the human in a way that it doesn't for animals, even though they, in effect, could be thwarting evolution. It's much sadder and much more horrific to see that our very means of knowing and surviving, individual thought, is being what's attacked. And you can understand there are all kinds of psychological reasons that might make it justifiable. In a pre-literate society, if all the knowledge from your ancestors is kept alive in an oral tradition, any diversion, any step away from the oral tradition is dangerous. You might lose the knowledge. You know, the samurai swords were made in Japan, were a military secret, but they were made by experts who passed it down on an oral tradition. Part of it was religious ritual. Part of it was actual technology. But you don't want to lose the religious ritual because you might be losing some important part of the technology. So there's a sort of inertia to tradition. There's a sort of, you don't want to change it. Obviously, in a pre-literate society, even more than when we have writing. But in our modern society, where we understand the value of, say, an individual scientist or an individual artist and how they could change the way we do things and live, it is criminal to single out the different. It is unhuman. It is a failure to recognize that which is the glory of our species, the individual creative mind.
Also related to the issue of fear, she talks about, quote, and I will explain what this quote means. Quote, this is the reason why the appeaser has a vested interest in maintaining his belief in the brute's existence, even a life of terror, with the excuse that he couldn't help it, is preferable to facing the full enormity of the fact that he was not robbed of self-esteem, but threw it away, and that his chronic sense of guilt does not come from the spurious sin of possessing intelligence, but from the actual crime of having betrayed it. Unquote. Wow. What does that mean?
You see, they are trying to retain their intelligence. They don't really feel guilty for being intelligent. They know they need it. They know it's there, and it's a reality. In fact, you can't stop reality from being reality. On the other hand, that kind of, it's a deeper, and this really is, it's a psychological phenomenon that's happening here with the appeaser. They have in effect selectively checked out their mind, but it wasn't their mind, the thing they were told to feel guilty about all along. No. It's their actual sense of self-esteem, their actual sense of self that's been destroyed. And so they're in this weird paradoxical tension, necessarily in this weird paradoxical tension. to the extent that you actually accept altruism, you must be, in effect, renouncing your mind, renouncing your own values. The brute is what they are, since they have renounced morality. In their own minds, the brute is, in effect, their projection of what humans must be. But of course, they still have the capacity. In other words, they have self-consciously checked out morality with the attempt to still retain their mind to some extent. Well, it's not the mind that they should feel guilty for, but it's the checking out of the morality. That's the betrayal. At some level, everybody knows they have choice. Everybody knows they have a responsibility to think these things through. To the extent that they have just sort of delivered that over to altruism, they have, in effect, projected what humanity is for them based on what they have done, the betrayal they have made in sort of cashing out morality.
And that's why there is such a hatred of people like Ayn Rand, right? Because every time that she exists and she does something like that, it's a reminder for them that they could have made a different choice.
Right. No, anyone who takes pride in something they've done, anyone who is happy and pleased with their own achievements, anyone who asserts they're just being assertive about your own beliefs, you're a dangerous thing. You're thinking for yourself. You think you're obviously emanating all this selfishness. You're thinking for yourself. You're thinking for a life that's for yourself. No, the minute you do that, you'll find it everywhere. Moral perfection is impossible. Why you need to insist on that? I say, well, I review my choices, and it seems to me, I didn't make any wrong choices, at least for this period of time. I was morally perfect. Oh, no, that's impossible. No one can be morally perfect. What a horrific sense, and that's what altruism implies. What a horrific sense of guilt and horrific view of humanity that must create, and inherently cynicism about ethics. No one can really be ethical. It's just not possible.
Also related to that, she talks about a phenomenon that she describes as moral cowardice, and you've already touched it, maybe not in those words, but one of the things that she talks about is how at the beginning people surrender the good because it's the good and appease evil because it's evil, and then she talks about how that becomes appeasing evil because it's evil, and then it starts to become an obliteration of the good, of trying to murk things in their mind. Could you discuss a bit more about what that phenomenon is?
You're attempting to retain your mind while chucking in values. That's a contradiction on the face of it. It really can't be pulled off. In a sense, the person who's said, I've turned the real social metaphysician who's turned his mind completely over to the minds of others or some significant group of others, in one sense is less betraying and less in a tense moment. He's just a mental slave all along. The compromise is what we're talking about here of the appeaser, the person who's attempting to retain rationality to some extent while still in effect buying the morality of altruism. That is what's going to have the effect you're talking about. Necessarily.
Robert says, James, you're going to have to take Amy and me out to lunch one day during OCON 2021 because I gave all my lunch money away on Super Chat.
And I owe the Nacers lunch from OCON in Cleveland. Unfortunately, I won't be in Austin in a couple of weeks, I'm sorry to say, but I still owe you guys lunch.
I was wondering if I have, I was wondering to take the discussion again towards metaphysical issues and integrated with our knowledge on art, which we have discussed in the past in Art and Sense of Life, or the psychoepistemology of art. and she has a comment. I hope I can find the quote later, and she talks about how the horrors and the awful things that are depicted in art serve as a way of them to confirming their view of life after all these conclusions that they have integrated. Could you comment a bit on that?
Right. If altruism necessarily leaves you with a cynical view of humanity, that view of values is going to be reflected in your sense of life. Again, this essay is sort of in midstream. It assumes a good deal of knowledge about objectivism, Ayn Rand's critique of altruism, Ayn Rand's basic understanding of human psychology as rooted in cognition, and art in particular. And she believes that art is the reason why people respond to art the way they do is because it reflects, in effect, their fundamental philosophical positions on metaphysical issues. And in effect, our values that we are seeing in art are metaphysical values that we're emotionally responding to on a deep level. Well, the metaphysical values of the altruist, of the moral cynic, of the person who thinks that humanity is a bunch of brutes who need to be ruled by an elite, is going to be reflected in what you respond to in art. Yeah, this is life to me. This is what the world means to me. It's going to be irrational. It's going to be necessarily cynical about human values. You're not going to find inspiration in heroes. You're not going to even find representation because it's an assault on reason in the entire realm of values, altruism. So there are a variety of senses of life. There are a variety of emotional manifestations. There are a variety of psychologies that altruism can result in. But it must always result in a dissing, in a contempt, a relative contempt for humanity. And that relative contempt for humanity will be reflected in a politics leaning toward dictatorship and in art that's leading toward the irrational, the negative view of humanity, or even non-representational, the irrational.
By the way, the quote is, quote, "The appeaser's inner state is revealed in the field of aesthetics. His sense of light dominates modern art and literature. The cult of depravity, the monotonous projection of cosmic terror, guilt, impotence, misery, doom, the compulsive preoccupation with the study of homicidal maniacs, a preoccupation resembling the mentality of a superstitious savage who fashions a voodoo doll in the belief that to reproduce is to master."
That's it. That's really it. It's a mystery. It's a kind. It boils down to this kind of voodoo doll mysticism, doesn't it? The most important thing just about you can think about, ethics, the values, the value of your own life, is necessarily divorced from reason, whether it's our intellectuals like David Hume or our religious leaders like the Pope telling us that both agree morality has nothing to do with reason. Once you've accepted that, either for pseudoscientific reasons or for mystical reasons, that is the state of mind you'll be in. That is the necessary condition of your soul.
And also related to another thing that you said is that one of the awful contradictions on this kind of mentality is that at the end, even when you had surrendered morality to achieve your mind, people end up granting the premise that intellectuality or any other kind of ideas are just things that one says to appease the masses.
It's a ritual. It's a formula. You know, it's no more than a magical incantation like abracadabra or open sesame. But that's what they're doing. It's a psychological, it's a mutual psychological appeasement that's going on rather than any kind of discussion of values or ethics or its role in human life. And if you think about it, morality is omnipresent. That's why it's a subject of philosophy. It is inescapable for the human being. It will affect the way he behaves in his own life. It'll affect his values across the board. Work, romance, politics, art, you name it. It must have this kind of comprehensive impact because that's the comprehensive impact of morality. Morality is a life and death issue. If we assign it to the irrationality of subjectivism or to the mysticism of the religious, what we have done is we're courting life and death. That simply. And we are causing psychological wreckage to ourselves, to our view of ourself, to our view of humanity, necessarily.
Could you comment a bit on, I want to move for the discussion towards what the masses really are, which is one of the last clarifications of the essay, but I was hoping if you have any examples of real life of this kind of character, because I can think of one very particular character in Ayn Rand's books that fits to this kind of mentality. But in real life, I was thinking maybe Picasso or maybe Truman Capote. But
Picasso is a very interesting person. I don't want to psychologize on any individual about this, but Picasso, began as kind of a talented representationalist artist, and then he went through different phases, and the different phases he went through were, all the way to experimenting with surrealism, through different phases of cubism, and before that even he was experimenting with. So it's almost like he's going through the different genre of what was then the contemporary thought in art. Instead of Howard Rourke, this is my style, my art, this is the way I think visual art should be done. Picasso is in effect like that eclecticist in the Fountainhead, right? Going through a different mood, fad moment. So Picasso has these different eras, his blue period or his analytic cubist period, as they'll break it down. But in effect, he's going through these different fads. It's not Picasso. And, people will say, oh, no. There is, in his blue period or in this moment of cubism, he's really contributed something new to cubism or art. But the point is that he's, in effect, taking himself through a whole series of mental steps conceptually, rather than doing art as he thinks art should be done. Andy Warhol, in his pop art, right? Art is only a reflection, right, of the values around us. Truman Capote is a more interesting one. And like I say, I don't want to psychologize about any of these artists. But for example, in Cold Blood, he discusses matter-of-factly these horrible maniacal serial killers, multiple killers, from a sympathetic psychological standpoint. There is a person who has taken morality, put it to one side, and now we're going to analyze these horrible monstrous killers from the standpoint of a amoral position on things. Each of them in their own way are reflecting different aspects of what Ayn Rand is talking about here. Yeah.
Picasso used to have an uncharged gun. So everyone that could ask him what his art meant, he would just pretend to shoot them.
It's not a question of whys or causes or understanding my art. You either get it or you don't.
Exactly.
And that makes it's mysticism on the face of it. It's religion.
And what about, would you agree that Robert Stadler is the person who fits this kind of mentality?
That was exactly who I was thinking of. The guy who is trying to retain a corner of rationality or intelligence. Please leave me my little corner to do my pure physics theoretical research, but I will spend the rest of my life apologizing to you so that I can get away with this little bit of reason over here. Exactly. And his view of humanity perfectly reflects this, right? Humanity to him is a bunch of, talk about the intellectual who would be afraid of the average guy on the street, right? Robert Stadler, the ordinary person, must fill him with terror because he has such contempt for humanity. That is a really good example. Robert Stadler is the kind of person we're talking about here. Altruism as appeasement. He is chucked in morality. He's willing to rule and be ruled so that he can get away with this little corner of his own rational activity. Bingo.
And I don't want to give away the end as a spoiler, but at the end, I think it has a lot to do with things that are described in this essay.
You see, what's great about without wanting to give spoilers too, what's great about Stadler is that he is an example of what you talk about in terms of the intelligent, the person who does stand up for morality, for self-esteem, for pride, for his own life. Someone like John Galt or Francisco d'Anconia. That's who represents the great threat to Stadler, right? They're at once a paradox. He values their superintelligence and talent. On the other hand, their independence, their moral pride, their self-esteem, that is a threat. They think for themselves. They think highly of themselves. They are the dangerous ones, in Stadler's view, even if they were the smartest and most talented ones. So that was a really good example.
What are the masses in reality? Or what is Ayn Rand's view of the masses? Are they really this kind of violent mobs?
Well, you know, unfortunately, the thing about humanity is that most people are busy doing life, their own thing. If I'm a plumber, an electrician, a house contractor, carpenter building something, I'm busy with my life. There's a division of labor in reality. And those who are professional intellectuals, who in the division of labor totally specialize in the realm of ideas, they become experts. And that's the whole point of the division of labor, right? But to a certain extent, that makes everyone else dependent on their expertise. Most people should be thinking for themselves, even when with respect to experts. Even if they go to a doctor or someone to build a house for them, they should be asking critical questions to make sure that what's going on is rational and that their expert is rational, knows what he or she is talking about, and will help me with my disease or build a house that'll stand. But most people aren't critical. And even worse, most people are uncritical when it comes to philosophy, especially morality. Morality is not to be questioned. Morality is a given. And to that extent, the masses are dependent on the intellectuals. To the extent the intellectuals themselves reflect this view that humanity are brutes, because that's the emanation from their own psychologies that altruism results in. So if humanity is a bunch of brutes to them, if they're treating humanity in this way, then humanity will live down to the worst expectations of the culture, no doubt. In effect, what the intellectual is doing is they are telling the masses in this area of expertise, yeah, you are brutes. Yeah, you do need to be ruled by force because you are, really rotten to the core, and you can't live up to this altruism, so it needs to be imposed on you by force anyway. So the masses can become a mob, when liberated, in effect, by the intellectuals, by the culture at large. But to that extent, people will live up or live down to the dominant moral views of their time and their culture. That is why philosophy is so important. Philosophy, we all depend upon, all of us. That's the unique thing about philosophy. We all depend upon moralists doing a good job, because to some extent, that is an expertise that affects each and every one of us.
The quote about that, she says, "The truly and deliberately evil men are a very small minority. It is the appeaser who unleashes them on mankind. It is the appeaser's intellectual abdication that invites them to take over. When a culture's dominant trend is geared to irrationality, the thugs win over the appeasers. When intellectual leaders fail to foster the best in the mixed, unformed, vacillating character of people at large, the thugs are sure to bring out the worst. When the ablest men turn into cowards, the average men turn into brutes."
Boy, if I could speak half as well as that brilliant writer could write, that was absolute poetry. My God, how true is that? When the intellectual defaults in that fashion, we can only expect the ordinary person to live down to that, to be brutes. What you've done is you've liberated, in effect, their brutish nature by chucking in rational morality.
And what does it mean that she says something like, the fact that no dictatorship has been able to be established without censorship what does that mean in this context?
You know something? In the contemporary world, we have better ideas. There are better ideas out there. People have heard about individual rights. People have heard about liberal democracy. People have heard about, if you went back in a time machine, maybe 500 years, you couldn't say this. But today, there have been moral arguments against slavery, against, we have Ayn Rand's arguments, right? The point is that today, if there is no censorship, better ideas are possible. Better ideas will get out. In a free competition of ideas, the better ideas will win. One of Ayn Rand's points politically is that freedom liberates the mind. And if we are truly free from coercion, there will be a definite tendency for reason and the rational to win over the irrational. The exact reverse order could happen, of course. But the point, though, is that there's an intimate relationship between these two things that cannot be escaped or avoided. They're intimately tied.
And I have two last questions, and maybe if there are super chat, like I can pitch some of them. So what is the solution to that? What is the solution, maybe in not only in the context of a society, but inside of a man's soul? What would you say to a young man who is in his teenage years and wants to be accepted and has this temptation of giving in? What would you say to him?
Well, there'd be a psychological answer and a philosophical answer. The philosophical answer is morality can be understood rationally. It is based on human beings' real needs. Values are a biological phenomenon. Human beings need to choose the right code of values if they hope to succeed, prosper, and survive. Morality is a field subject to reason, just like anything else, just like physics. Ethics is a science. So that's the philosophical answer. There's no reason to chuck in morality if you want to keep your mind first. The psychological answer, which is a little more subtle, is, and that's what, in effect, we have to overcome first, in a weird way. The independent mind has to stand up psychologically for itself, for its own ability to think. And that takes tremendous courage. I would give a teenager the fountainhead. Individualism is the answer. The belief that nothing can take precedence over the judgment of your own mind, and never yield that to anyone or anything. The judgment of your mind must be sought. Reality is an absolute, and reason is your only means of getting it. And reason is a faculty of the individual, you. There is no pinch hitter for your judgment and thinking. And that is the message that has to be gotten across. The confidence that young people need to have. And it takes courage, self-esteem, a spine of steel, and forgive me, gonads of iron, because to stand up to the moral pressure, all that power of morality, the guilt that comes with the power of morality, the social pressure that comes from a whole group, takes enormous courage. But nothing can take precedence over the value of your own mind. So I'd give them the fountainhead and tell them that, yeah, if necessary, and we don't always have to do this, but if necessary, like Howard Rourke, we have to be willing to stand up against the whole world for our perception of the truth, for our values, and that all value and all discovery of truth comes from that. So the value of the individual, the bucking up that teenager as much as you can against the social pressures that he or she will inevitably face, and providing the philosophical answer that's necessary here. There is a morality of reason. There is a morality for life on earth. We don't need to chuck it into the skeptics like Hume or to the religious nuts.
Thank you very much, James. I'm tempted to finish with that note. I don't know. I have a small question there, but is there something else that you think we should have touched but I didn't ask?
Well, as usual, you've covered it pretty well there, Alejandro.
Thank you. So I have a small question, and it's related to something that she says at the middle of the essay, and she says that um, the fear of the good from these kind of people, summed up by the fear of the brute, is a kind of mentality which dictators count upon. And I didn't really get what that means. Could you explain a bit on that?
The threat to the dictator is the individual who's thinking for himself out there. That's why the dictator imposes censorship. To the extent the masses have bought in to the threat of this individual who's standing out for himself alone, to the extent he agrees, yeah, that guy's dangerous and a threat, he's going to be the perfect pawn for the dictator. He's going to help make it possible. Dictatorships can't really survive if everyone in the country opposes it. Not even dictatorships. Not even in this technological age, right? Look at what happened to the Soviet Union. You know, they'll collapse like that, no matter how scary and intimidating the totalitarian dictatorship is. What keeps it floating is really enough people, I don't know about a majority, but enough people in the country buying in effect, to the moral premises of the dictator. And here it's a psychological premise of the dictator. That guy who stands out on his own is dangerous. He is a threat. And there, to the extent that the masses have bought into that idea, for example, they are in fact supporting the dictator. Just like the intellectual who chucks in morality or appeases the altruist, he has turned his intellect into the service of justifying slavery and dictatorship. At the end of the day, whatever his initial motives were, he is in effect going to end up justifying dictatorship and the rule by force. This is true with the masses in a dictatorship. They are the ones supporting and keeping the dictatorship floating because, in effect, they buy the same psychological premises that created the dictatorship in the first place. Human beings are rotten. They can't rule themselves. They need to be ruled from on high because, in effect, people are rotten and can't live up to altruism.
Thank you. So I think
Your view of humanity will shape your view of ethics, right? And your view of ethics is based on a certain view of humanity. And you can really see that in the mentality of those who submit to dictatorship.
Thank you. So I think we are out of questions today. I thank you a lot, James, for these kind of discussions. They're really interesting all the time. And I hope that people are also enjoying them as much as me.
No, I enjoy them very much too. Your questions are excellent, and these are fun discussions. They really are.
I agree. They're very fun. Hopefully, we're adding a lot of value to the people that are going through these essays, maybe the first or maybe the 10th time, whatever the
and all those
knowledge.
And all those talented and intelligent young people out there who are under such social pressure to feel guilt for their ability, to feel that they have to put their ability in the service of something greater than themselves. It's to them that I hope this message reaches, really.
I hope that too. So with that being said, I thank you, and thank you the audience for everything. Thank you, Bonnie, Robert, and Jonathan for the super chats. And if you like these discussions, feel free to consider joining ARC UK, a membership, £10 a month. They start the memberships. Thank you very much, James, and see you next Wednesday.
Take care.